My name is Claire Okamoto. I am 41 years old, and the first time my sister Renee asked me to cover a hotel bill she had promised to split, I thought she had simply forgotten her wallet. That was 11 years ago. The charge was $214 for a single night in Portland during our cousin's wedding. By the time I stopped counting, the total had reached $83,600. I know the number exactly because I verified every line against bank records, credit card statements, and receipts I had stored in a fireproof lockbox in my garage. $83,600. I held that figure in my hands on a Wednesday evening last October, printed across 14 pages of itemized expenses, and I did not move for a long time. My eyes traced the columns the way they always do when something is wrong with a structure, scanning for the load-bearing failure, the point where weight exceeded capacity. I could smell the toner from the pages. The kitchen faucet dripped twice behind me. The overhead light buzzed at a frequency I had never noticed before. I stood at my counter and felt the number settle into my chest like rebar cooling inside a concrete pour. My fingers pressed into the granite hard enough that the ridges of my knuckles went white. I was already counting. Not the money, the years. Before I take you through that list, year by year, let me explain the skill that made me the person who could assemble it. I have spent 17 years as a municipal bridge inspector for the state of Oregon. My work involves climbing underneath structures that thousands of people drive across every day and identifying the cracks they cannot see from the surface. Hairline fractures in concrete abutments, corrosion patterns in steel gussets that suggest fatigue nobody reported. Bearing pads shifted 2 millimeters from where they were seated during construction. I measure deflection under live load. I photograph bolt heads from angles most engineers never bother with, because the failure, when it comes, always starts where nobody thought to look. I carry a thickness gauge, a crack comparator card, and a flashlight rated for confined spaces. I have crawled through box girders in August heat and dangled from safety harnesses above frozen rivers in January, while ice formed on the cable above my head. My hands know what a sound weld feels like versus a cold joint before my brain finishes processing what my fingers touched. I can tell you whether a rivet was driven hot or cold by running my thumb across its head with my eyes closed. That skill had kept 47 bridges in active service across 3 counties for nearly 2 decades. It was about to audit my own family. I kept records of all of it. Not because I planned to use them, because that is what I do. I track things, I measure things, I log deficiencies by date, location, description, and severity, and I note the recommended action even when nobody asks for one. It became a habit I did not notice until the habit became evidence. Before I take you through what those records show, tell me, what time is it where you are? Because I remember the time of every single incident on this list, not because I have a perfect memory, because I started writing them down the same way I log deficiencies on inspection reports. And once a pattern enters my spreadsheet, it does not leave. The system that allowed $83,000 to leave my accounts and enter my family's spending had been in place for over 30 years. My parents, Jean and Donna Okamoto, ran a modest landscaping company in Salem. They raised 4 children in a 3-bedroom house with 1 bathroom and a backyard full of commercial mowers. I was the second oldest. Renee, 3 years my senior, was the firstborn, and the family's announced priority from the day I was old enough to understand what priorities meant. Renee had the lead in every school play. Renee's prom dress was custom altered by a seamstress who charged more than my mother's weekly grocery budget. Renee's freshman year at a private university cost more than my parents could sustain, but they took a second mortgage on the house because Renee's future mattered in a way the rest of ours apparently did not. My younger brothers, Dustin and Kyle, learned to stay quiet and out of the way. I learned something different. I learned to be useful. And useful, in my family, meant handling what Renee would not. I mowed clients' lawns during summers when Renee worked a boutique counter downtown, earning tips she spent on clothes before her next shift began. I reconciled my parents' business receipts at 16 because their bookkeeper quit and nobody else volunteered. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator and a shoebox of crumpled invoices while Renee watched television in the next room. I applied to a state engineering program with a full scholarship because I understood, without anyone saying it directly, that there was no second mortgage coming for me. There was no custom alteration. There was no announced priority. There was Claire, who would figure it out. And I did. The first time Renee asked me to cover that Portland hotel room, she was 29 and had just ended a relationship with a man who had been paying most of her rent. She said she could not afford the trip alone. I paid the $214. She never mentioned it again. Not a thank you. Not an offer to reimburse me when she got back on her feet. Just silence where the acknowledgement should have been, and the silence taught me what the money could not. I was not being asked for help. I was being assigned a role. 6 months later, she asked me to cover her car insurance for 1 month after she missed a payment. I paid. The month became 3 months, and by the time I said something about it, my mother called me petty during a Sunday phone call. Renee is going through a difficult time. You have a state job with benefits. Why are you keeping score? I was not keeping score. I was keeping records. There is a difference, and it took me a decade to understand that the difference was the only thing that would eventually save me. The incidents accumulated the way structural fatigue accumulates in a bridge deck that nobody maintains. Invisibly, incrementally, and then all at once when the load exceeds what the degraded material can bear. In 2016, Renee asked me to co-sign a lease for a luxury apartment in the Pearl District that cost more than her monthly income could cover. I declined. My mother stopped speaking to me for 2 full weeks and left me off the family text chain for Easter dinner. In 2017, Renee's car was repossessed after she missed 4 consecutive payments, and my father called me on a Tuesday evening and asked me to loan her $4,000 for a replacement vehicle. I sent $3,000 because that was what a reasonable used car cost in our area. Renee bought a car for $6,000 and told my parents I had covered the full amount. I found out 3 months later when my father thanked me for being so generous, quoting a number I had not sent. I said nothing. I walked to my garage that night, opened my laptop on the workbench beside my inspection kit, and created a spreadsheet. I typed the date, the amount requested, the amount sent, and what I had been told versus what I had actually paid. That was the night the ledger began. Row 1, November 14, 2017. Discrepancy, $1,000. The irony is that I had spent my entire career documenting tiny failures that everyone else insisted were fine. Hairline cracks someone had painted over, bolts someone had finger tightened instead of torquing to spec. I wrote reports that said, in precise technical language, this structure is not as sound as the people who depend on it believe. And every evening I drove home from those inspections and walked into a family whose finances I was subsidizing without ever once running the numbers on what it was costing me. I was the inspector who never turned her flashlight on her own foundation. I was crawling through box girders, looking for corrosion, while the corrosion in my own life was eating through the steel behind my back. By 2019, the requests had a rhythm as predictable as a seasonal load report. Renee needed help with a security deposit because her landlord required first and last month. Renee's dental work was not fully covered because she had chosen a provider outside her insurance network. Renee's son Caleb, who was 7 years old and had my father's quiet eyes, needed new cleats for travel soccer, and Renee's boyfriend at the time had just lost his job driving for a delivery service. Each request arrived through my parents as intermediaries, framed as temporary, framed as urgent, and framed with the implicit accusation that refusing would prove I did not love my family. My brothers contributed nothing. Dustin had moved to Boise and rarely called. Kyle lived 20 minutes from my parents and visited on holidays carrying a bottle of mid-range wine and no checkbook. I was the only sibling sending money because I was the only sibling who had been trained since childhood to believe that being capable meant being perpetually obligated. In the summer of 2021, Renee announced she was organizing a family reunion at a rental house on the Oregon coast near Cannon Beach. She presented it to everyone as her gift to the family, her effort to bring us together after the isolation of the previous year. She chose the property, set the dates for late July, emailed an itinerary with tide pool walks and bonfire schedules, and told each household their share of the cost. My share was $2,200. I paid it 3 weeks early because I wanted to stop thinking about it and get back to a bridge rehabilitation project that was running behind schedule. What I did not know then, and would not learn until 14 months later, was that the actual per-household cost was $1,400. Renee had inflated my portion by $800 and used the difference to cover her own share entirely. She had paid nothing for the trip she called her gift to the family. That brought the running total to $47,200. And we were only in 2021. That coast trip was unremarkable, except for one detail that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. On the second evening, while everyone ate salmon and grilled corn on the deck overlooking the ocean, Renee's son Caleb reached for the salt and knocked his juice across the table and onto my work bag. I pulled the bag away immediately and checked the zipper pocket where I kept a portable hard drive with inspection photographs. Renee laughed from the head of the table and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Relax, Claire. It's not like your work stuff matters to anyone but you." My father chuckled. My mother looked at her plate and moved a piece of corn from one side to the other. Kyle drank his wine. Caleb apologized with genuine embarrassment, and I told him it was completely fine and helped him clean the spill. But I noticed something in the way Renee delivered that line. The casualness of it. The absolute certainty that diminishing what I did for a living would cost her nothing. Because it never had. She had been charging me a premium for years, and mocking my profession at the same time, and the table had absorbed both without flinching. I'm going to take you through the rest of this year by year. But first, drop your location in the comments. I want to know how many people are watching someone finally read the numbers out loud. Because these numbers were silent for over a decade. They are not going to be silent anymore. Everything changed in October of last year because of a document I was never supposed to see. I want to be precise about how I found it, because it was not luck, it was proximity. My parents had asked me to drive to their house on a Saturday afternoon to help my father scan paperwork for a life insurance review their agent had requested. I agreed because that is what I do. I show up. I handle the logistics nobody else will touch. While feeding policy documents through their desktop scanner in the spare bedroom they used as an office, I found a printed email wedged between two insurance writers. It was from Renee to my mother, dated 4 months earlier, June of that year. The subject line read, "Claire's share for the Coast House." The body contained 3 sentences. I told Claire her portion was $2,200. Actual split is $1,400 per household. Keep the difference between us. She won't check. I held that page under the desk lamp. I read it 3 times. My breathing did not change. My hands did not shake. I held the paper the way I hold a photograph of a corroded steel plate during a detailed bridge element inspection. Steady, close, tilted slightly toward the light source so the toner caught the grain of the paper. Something in me was running numbers I had not asked it to run. The spreadsheet in my garage was no longer a record. It was an open investigation, and every line I had marked as confirmed accurate was now suspect. Because if Renee had inflated one cost with my mother's knowledge and participation, the entire history of requests was compromised. Every intermediary number, every relayed amount, every time my mother had said, "Renee needs this much," those words now carried a margin I had never tested. I photographed the email with my phone, ensuring the date, the sender line, and the full body were legible. I replaced it exactly where I had found it, between the same 2 pages, at the same angle. I finished the scanning, told my father the files were uploaded to his cloud folder, and drove the 45 minutes home in silence, with the radio off and the window cracked enough to feel the October air on my face. That night, I opened the spreadsheet at my workbench and began the re-verification process. I treated it the same way I treat a bridge that has received a failing score on one element. If one component has degraded beyond acceptable limits, you do not assume the rest are sound. You inspect everything. I started with the Coast House. I called the property management company and confirmed the nightly rate for our specific dates. I calculated the true per-household cost. The $800 inflation was confirmed within 20 minutes. Then I checked the dental bill from 2019 that my mother had forwarded to me as a screenshot on her phone. The screenshot showed a balance of $1,900. I called the dental office on the following Monday morning, identified myself as the person who had paid the balance by credit card, provided the last 4 digits of the card and the transaction date, and asked for a duplicate itemized statement. The actual balance had been $1,100. Someone had altered the screenshot, changing 1 digit in the total. When I enlarged both images on my monitor, the 9 in the altered version was slightly bolder than the surrounding numbers. The font weight did not match. The kerning between the altered digit and the digit to its right was compressed by roughly half a point compared to the original document spacing, an almost perfect forgery. Any reasonable person would have accepted it without question. But I had spent years comparing hairline differences in weld profiles and measuring crack widths to the nearest hundredth of an inch, and a font weight discrepancy was louder to my eyes than a shout. Layer by layer, the evidence expanded outward the way cracks propagate through overstressed concrete. The dental bill discrepancy was $800. The Coast House inflation was $800. A car repair my mother had relayed in 2020 as costing $3,000 turned out to be $1,900 when I obtained the original repair order directly from the shop using the vehicle identification number Renee had included in a text message 2 years earlier when she was asking me to call ahead and arrange the service. An emergency vet bill for Caleb's dog in 2022, quoted to me at $1,200, had actually been $740 when I contacted the veterinary clinic and requested a duplicate invoice under the pet's registered name. Caleb's soccer tournament registration that my mother said cost $650 per player was actually $410 according to the club's published fee schedule, which I found archived on their website. Each individual inflation was small enough to be dismissed as a rounding error or a miscommunication. Taken together across 11 years, the pattern was architectural. It was load-bearing. Renee had been adding a margin to every request that passed through my parents, and my mother had been transmitting the inflated numbers without correction. Whether my mother participated in creating every altered figure or simply chose never to verify them, the result was identical. I had been paying a surcharge on family loyalty for more than a decade. That brought the running total of phantom charges alone, the difference between what I paid and what things actually cost, to approximately $19,400. Added to the genuine expenses I had carried that no other sibling shared, the full total held firm at $83,600. I printed the complete audit, 14 pages. I placed it in the fireproof lockbox and closed the lid. I went to bed and slept more soundly than I had in months because the inspection was complete and the deficiency report was ready to be filed. The family's annual Thanksgiving dinner was held at Renee's townhome that year. She had purchased the place 18 months earlier with help from my parents, who had gifted her a portion of the down payment drawn from their home equity line. Renee had remodeled the kitchen with white quartz countertops, pendant lighting over a marble island she had chosen from a design catalog, and open shelving displaying matching ceramic dishes she had purchased on credit. She had hung framed photographs in the hallway of family vacations, including the coast trip I had overpaid for. The house was her monument. She greeted guests at the front door, wearing an apron that read, "The Okamoto Kitchen," in hand-embroidered script. It was the room she believed she controlled completely. I arrived carrying a dish of roasted Brussels sprouts with shallots and a leather portfolio inside my bag. My parents were already seated at the dining table. Dustin had flown in from Boise and was leaning against the counter holding a beer. Kyle had brought wine and was pouring it into glasses Renee had set out. Caleb was playing a handheld game on the living room couch with his shoes off and his feet tucked underneath him. Renee smiled at me from behind the island. "Claire, can you carve the turkey? You're the only one with steady hands." The casualness of her voice was identical to the casualness of that email I had photographed in my parents' scanner tray. She had no idea what I was carrying. Dinner proceeded, for 40 minutes of ordinary family noise. Renee told a story about installing the bathroom tile herself, though I knew from a contractor's invoice I had seen during my parents' insurance filing that she had hired someone and billed the labor to my father's credit card. My mother praised the stuffing recipe, my father asked about my work, and I described a routine inspection without detail. Kyle refilled glasses. Dustin told a story about his neighbor's dog. Caleb asked to be excused and was told to wait. The table was warm, the food was seasoned well, and for a brief window I let myself wonder whether the 14 pages in my bag were worth what they would cost every person in this room. Then Renee leaned toward me and said, "By the way, Caleb's club team has a tournament in Arizona in January. Flights and hotel for the two of us would be around $1,600. Could you help out? I'll send you the details later." The table did not react. My mother nodded faintly. My father cut his turkey. Kyle looked at his plate. Another request. Another season. Another invoice delivered at a dinner table, as though it were a compliment. I set my fork down with enough care that the metal did not touch the ceramic. "How much is the actual cost, Renee?" She blinked. I just said, $1,600. I'd like to see the registration confirmation and the booking receipt before I commit to anything. My mother's head turned sharply toward me. "Claire, this is Thanksgiving. Don't interrogate your sister over a children's soccer trip." "I'm not interrogating anyone. I'm asking for documentation, the way anyone would before writing a check." Renee let out a small laugh, controlled, dismissive. "Since when do you need receipts from family?" "Since the dental bill in 2019. The temperature of the room dropped by 10 degrees in the space between that sentence and the silence that followed it. Renee's smile stayed on her face, but her fingers pressed flat against the marble island, white at the tips. My mother reached for her water glass and did not drink from it. My father stopped chewing and looked at me with an expression I had never seen from him in 41 years, something between recognition and dread, like a man who has just heard the first crack in a beam he swore was solid. "What about the dental bill?" Renee said, her voice a half-register higher. I unzipped the portfolio and placed the first page on the island between us. "This is the screenshot you sent Mom showing a balance of $1,900. I placed the second page beside it. "This is the duplicate statement I obtained from the dental office showing the actual balance of $1,100. The 9 in the screenshot was altered. The font weight is inconsistent with the surrounding characters, and the kerning is compressed." Renee straightened. "That's ridiculous. You're reading into a blurry phone screenshot like it's one of your bridge reports." I called the office. They confirmed the original amount. The discrepancy is $800. My mother set her fork down. "Claire, families help each other. A few dollars difference over something that old doesn't warrant this." $800, repeated across 11 separate transactions over 11 years. It warrants this. I placed 6 more pages on the counter in deliberate sequence. The Coast House rate confirmation from the property management company alongside Renee's quoted figure. The car repair order from the shop showing $1,900 against the $3,000 my mother had relayed. The vet bill at $740 versus the $1,200 I had paid. The lease listing price archived from the property website at $300 less than what I was told Renee needed for her deposit calculations. The soccer registration fee published on the club's own page versus what my mother had quoted. Each page was paired, what I was told on the left, what was real on the right. Red ink circling each discrepancy. Renee's posture changed. She crossed her arms and her jaw tightened in a way that reminded me of a beam under compression, holding shape but straining. "You've been investigating me?" Your own sister? Going behind my back, calling businesses, pulling records? I've been verifying what I paid for, the way I verify every structure I'm responsible for. My father leaned forward, both palms flat on the table. Claire, this is not the time or place for this kind of thing. You're right, Dad. It should have happened years ago. But you were the ones who told me not to keep score. Renee shifted tactics the way I had watched her shift them my entire life, smoothly, instinctively, without appearing to choose. You're doing this because you're jealous. You've always resented that I have Caleb and a home and a full life, and you have your government job and your empty condo and your inspection reports. This is what happens when someone has nothing to come home to. She looked at my mother. Mom, tell her she's doing this because she's angry about her own life. My mother hesitated. I watched her calculate. Claire, you've always been so independent. We never worried about you, the way we worried about Renee. Maybe we leaned on you too much, but that's because we trusted you. You trusted me not to check. Kyle set his wineglass down and said nothing, but he did not look away from the papers. Dustin stepped closer to the island and studied the columns, reading them for the first time. His lips moved slightly as he added figures in his head. Renee pulled Caleb from the living room by the arm and positioned him beside her at the counter. You're doing this in front of my son on Thanksgiving. What kind of person does that to a child? Caleb looked at the spread of papers, then at my face. Aunt Claire, what's wrong? I crouched so I was level with him. Nothing is wrong with you, buddy. Adults are having an adult conversation. You did absolutely nothing wrong. Okay? He nodded. I stood. Renee pressed harder, her voice rising. After everything I've done for this family, after I hosted every holiday, after I was the one who stayed close to Mom and Dad while you disappeared into your career and your bridges, you sit at my table and accuse me of stealing from you. 3 tactics deployed. Denial of the evidence. Reframing me as the jealous aggressor. Family loyalty appeal wrapped in moral superiority. She had not yet reached the 4th. Then a voice came from the hallway behind me. My father's older brother, Uncle Richard, had arrived late and let himself in through the side door using a key Renee had given him when she moved in. Richard was a retired CPA who had prepared my parents' tax returns for over 20 years. He stood in the kitchen doorway, wearing a fleece vest and holding a glass baking dish covered in foil. He was looking at the papers spread across Renee's marble island with the quiet focus of a man who had read 10,000 financial documents in his career. I recognize that spreadsheet format, he said. He set the dish on the counter. Jean, I called you 18 months ago and told you the numbers Renee was quoting for household expenses didn't align with what I was seeing in your tax documents. You told me I was overthinking things and asked me to let it go. My father's mouth opened. It closed again without producing sound. Richard looked at me. How far back does your documentation go? 11 years, 46 verified transactions. He nodded once, slowly, the way structural engineers nod when a test result confirms what their instinct already told them. I only caught irregularities in 3 years of returns, but the pattern I flagged matches what you've documented here. Renee's composure fractured visibly. Uncle Richard, this is a family matter. This is Thanksgiving dinner, not a tax hearing. Renee, inflated figures that appear on tax-deductible claims make it a tax matter whether it's Thanksgiving or not. The room held perfectly still. Renee looked from Richard to my mother to my father, and found no one willing to meet her eyes. Caleb had drifted back to the couch. Dustin's hand rested on the island beside the papers. Kyle stared at the table. I spoke one sentence into that silence. Renee does not ask for help. She submits invoices with a markup and calls it love. I did not elaborate. I collected the pages from the counter in order, returned them to the portfolio, and zipped it closed. I placed the Brussels sprouts on the counter beside the stove. On my way to the door, I stopped in the living room. Caleb was watching me from the couch with his game paused. Your mom loves you very much, I said, and none of what just happened changes that. I want you to know that, okay? Okay, he said quietly. I left through the front door and drove home with the portfolio on the passenger seat, and the window cracked to the November air. The consequences arrived the way deferred maintenance always arrives, not as a catastrophic failure, but as a slow, expensive correction that everyone should have authorized years ago. Within the first week, my mother called 4 times. The first call was pure anger, 15 minutes of accusation that I had humiliated Renee in her own home. The second was bargaining, a suggestion that we could agree the numbers were misunderstandings and move forward. The third call was mostly silence, interrupted by crying that my mother tried to muffle by covering the phone. The fourth call, 5 days after Thanksgiving, was the closest my mother had come to honesty in my lifetime. I knew the dental number looked different from what the office originally told Renee. I told myself it didn't matter, because you could afford it, and Renee couldn't. I told myself that every time. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not forgive. I told her I needed time, and that needing time was not a punishment. My father sent me a 3-paragraph email 11 days after Thanksgiving. He wrote that he had ignored Uncle Richard's warning because confronting Renee would have meant confronting the system he had helped build around her since she was 18 years old. He called it the path of least resistance, and then he wrote something that surprised me. I chose your sister's comfort over your fairness, and I chose it every single time it was offered to me as an option. That is not a failure of communication. It is a failure of character, and it is not your fault. Kyle called me the following Saturday morning while I was reviewing a bridge deck condition report at my kitchen table. His voice was careful and halting. He told me he had reread the pages I had placed on Renee's counter because Dustin had photographed them on his phone before leaving. Kyle had spent the entire week cross-referencing the red-circled figures with his own memory of family conversations, and he realized he had heard my mother relay several of those inflated numbers and never once questioned them. I should have been paying my share of family costs for years, he said. I let you carry everything because nobody expected anything from me, and I liked it that way. He offered to reimburse me for a portion. I told him I did not want his money. I wanted him to stop pretending the system had been invisible. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm not going to pretend anymore." That was the beginning of Kyle becoming someone different, though the becoming would take months. Uncle Richard, feeling professionally obligated after reviewing the documents at Thanksgiving, conducted a limited audit of the tax returns he had prepared for my parents over the preceding 4 years. He discovered that 3 deductions claimed through my parents' filings, related to dependent care and household medical expenses, were based on figures that did not match the actual costs verifiable through third-party records. The inflated amounts were not enormous individually, but they were systematic, and they created a filing accuracy problem that Richard could not ethically ignore. He informed my parents they would need to submit amended returns for 2 tax years. The penalties and interest were manageable, but humiliating. My parents paid them from their savings account without asking me for the money. It was the first financial consequence they had absorbed themselves in as long as I could remember. Renee went silent for nearly 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. No calls, no texts, no messages through my parents. Then she posted a lengthy statement on social media about family members who weaponize generosity and use financial tracking to control people who are already vulnerable. She did not name me, but the description was unmistakable. She deleted the post within 4 hours after Richard's daughter, my cousin Megan, commented with a single line, "Which generosity are you referring to, Renee, yours or Claire's?" The comment received 47 reactions before the post vanished. In January, Caleb's soccer club held its winter tournament in Arizona as scheduled. Renee could not afford the flights and hotel. She asked my parents, who declined for the first time in Caleb's 12 years of life. I contacted the club treasurer directly, verified the actual registration and travel fee, and paid $740 for Caleb's participation, the real amount, which I confirmed against the published fee schedule. I arranged for him to travel with his teammate's family, whose parents I had spoken with by phone and trusted. Renee found out when Caleb told her excitedly that Aunt Claire had handled everything and he could still go. She did not call to thank me. She did not send a message. That particular silence was different from all the silences that came before it. It was the silence of someone who understood, for the first time, that I would continue protecting her child without protecting her. By March, Renee had refinanced her townhome at a significantly higher interest rate after my parents declined to continue supplementing the equity payments that Richard's audit had revealed. She sold the pendant lighting fixtures and the marble island to a kitchen salvage dealer and replaced them with laminate countertops and a ceiling-mounted fluorescent fixture. She found full-time employment as an office administrator at a dental practice in Tigard, which carried an irony I chose not to mention to anyone. She began paying her own bills in full, on documented amounts, for what appeared to be the first time in her adult life. The townhome hallway still had the framed photographs from the coast trip, but I heard from Kyle that she had taken down the one of all of us standing on the deck. I did not ask why. Dustin returned to Boise after Thanksgiving, without saying much to anyone, but starting in January he began calling me once a month. Short conversations, the weather in Idaho, a hiking trail he had found, a question about whether I thought he should refinance his own mortgage at a lower rate. Nothing important. Which made them the most important conversations we had ever had. Kyle volunteered to host Easter at his apartment in Portland, the first holiday he had ever organized. He served store-bought dinner rolls, slightly overcooked ham, and roasted potatoes that were crispy on the outside and underdone in the center. It was the most honest meal I had eaten with a member of my family in years. He had also, without telling me, sent Renee a check for $2,000 with a note that said, "My share, late, sorry." It was not enough. But it was a start he had chosen to make without being asked, and that mattered more than the amount. In April, Renee sent me a letter. Not a text message, not an email, not a voicemail. A letter on plain stationery in her own handwriting, mailed to my condo with a stamp and a return address. She wrote that she had started meeting with a financial counselor every other week and had reviewed her own income and spending for the first time without anyone else's money blurring the picture. She said the dental screenshot had been altered deliberately and that she had done it herself using a photo editing app on her phone. She admitted to personally inflating 6 of the 11 transactions I had flagged. The other 5, she wrote, had been inflated by my mother, without Renee's direct knowledge, but also without her objection when she saw the amounts I paid. She wrote one sentence that I read more times than I have read any inspection report in my career. I told myself you didn't notice, because you didn't care about money the way I did. The truth is, I told myself that because believing it made it easier to keep asking. The letter did not request forgiveness. It did not ask for a phone call or a meeting. It did not attach a price to its honesty. That was what made it real. I placed it in the fireproof lockbox beside the spreadsheets and the photographed email and the duplicate dental statement, and I closed the lid. My own life moved in the direction it had always been moving, only now without the drag of an unseen current pulling resources out of my accounts every few months. I received a promotion to senior inspector with oversight of a regional bridge inventory program. My investment portfolio crossed a milestone I had been working toward since my early 30s. I completed a weekend course in advanced concrete petrography that I had been postponing for 3 years because the timing always conflicted with some family obligation. On Saturdays, I hiked the trails outside Portland with my friend Lena, who had never once asked me how much my condo cost or whether my family approved of the way I spent my time. The ordinary texture of those days, the coffee at 6 in the morning, the sound of my boots on wet gravel, the weight of a good flashlight in my hand, felt like something I had earned by refusing to keep subsidizing its absence. I have thought carefully about what it means to carry a running total inside your body for 11 years. The spreadsheet was 14 pages when I printed it, but the cost it could not capture was the slow corrosion of trust, the way I hesitated every time my phone rang with a 503 area code, the way I double-checked restaurant bills, not because I was frugal, but because my own family had trained me to expect a hidden surcharge on belonging. The numbers told me what left my account. They could not measure what it felt like to realize that every request had been a transaction disguised as closeness, that the woman I called my sister had looked at me across a Thanksgiving table and seen a revenue source wearing a fleece jacket and holding a dish of Brussels sprouts. What I have learned, and what I am still learning, is that loyalty and transparency are not enemies. They are conditions of the same structure. A family that cannot survive an audit was never built on trust. It was built on the willingness of one person to keep paying without examining the invoice. The moment that person holds the pages up to the light and reads the actual figures, the structure does not collapse because of the reading. It reveals the collapse that was already there, hidden beneath the paint and the pendant lighting and the hand-embroidered apron. The inspection did not cause the damage. The inspection made the damage visible, and visibility, however painful, is the first requirement of repair. On a clear Saturday morning in May, I drove to my garage, opened the fireproof lockbox, and removed the 14-page printout. I fed every page through my shredder, one at a time, listening to the teeth catch the paper. The numbers were backed up. The records were preserved digitally, but the physical weight of that document had lived in my house long enough. When the last page was gone, I closed the lockbox, walked back inside, and opened my laptop to the investment account I had been building since I was 23 years old. The balance on the screen was a different number than the one I had shredded. This one belonged entirely to me. Nobody had inflated it, nobody had marked it up, nobody had taken a margin from it and called the margin love. I closed the laptop, poured a cup of coffee, and stood at my kitchen window watching the morning light cross the counter where I had first held those 14 pages 5 months earlier. The faucet did not drip. I had fixed it in December. If you sat down tonight and added up everything you have given to the people who call you family, not in gratitude but in quiet obligation, not because you wanted to, but because the system was designed so that you would, what would the total be? And if you saw that number printed across 14 pages, circled in red ink, sorted by date, would you keep paying the markup? Or would you finally read the invoice out loud and let the room hear what love actually cost? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. We hope it reminded you that your dignity is not negotiable, and that setting a boundary, even a painful one, can be an act of love for yourself and everyone the pattern would have reached next.